The late afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory, as Sheriff Ethan Carter made his final rounds before heading home. At 34, Ethan had worn the badge for nearly 6 years, long enough to understand that keeping peace in a frontier town required equal measures of diplomacy and determination. The recent Apache raids on nearby settlements had left everyone on edge, and tensions between the white settlers and the local tribes had reached a dangerous boiling point. Cedar Ridge sat precariously on the edge of Apache territory, a small but growing community of miners, ranchers, and merchants who had carved their existence from the unforgiving desert. The town's survival depended on an uneasy truce with the Apache bands that controlled the surrounding mountains, but that truce grew more fragile with each passing week as fear and prejudice festered on both sides. Ethan adjusted his hat against the setting sun and checked his pocket watch. Nearly 5 o'clock, time to head back to his modest cabin on the outskirts of town. As sheriff, he could have lived above the jail in the center of Cedar Ridge, but he preferred the quiet solitude of his small homestead, where he could think clearly and escape the constant demands of his office. The dirt road that led to his cabin wound through a series of low hills covered with scrub oak and mesquite, and it was there, about a mile from town, that Ethan encountered a sight that stopped him cold. A young Apache woman sat slumped against a large boulder, her traditional buckskin dress torn and stained with dirt and sweat. In her arms, she cradled an infant whose weak cries barely carried on the evening breeze. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver as he surveyed the surrounding terrain for signs of an ambush. Apache raids often employed tactics of misdirection, using women and children as bait to lure unsuspecting whites into carefully planned traps. But as he watched the woman struggle to lift her head at the sound of his approaching horse, he realized this was no deception. She was genuinely in distress. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair that hung in matted strand around her face. Her dark eyes, though dulled by exhaustion and dehydration, held an intelligence and dignity that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of his own sister back in Missouri. Most striking of all was her obvious desperation. She was dying of thirst in the desert heat, and her baby was suffering alongside her. "Ma'am," Ethan called softly as he dismounted, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow and non-threatening. "You need help?" The woman's eyes focused on him with visible effort, and she tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from her cracked lips. She gestured weakly toward her mouth, then toward the baby, the universal language of need, transcending any barriers of culture or language. Ethan quickly retrieved his water canteen from his saddle and approached cautiously. The woman's eyes tracked his every movement, but rather than fear, he saw desperate hope flickering in their depths. When he knelt beside her and offered the canteen, she accepted it with trembling hands and drank deeply before carefully giving water to her infant. "How long have you been out here?" Ethan asked, though he didn't expect an answer in English. Many Apache spoke some English due to their interactions with traders and soldiers, but communication was always uncertain. 2 days, the woman replied in heavily accented but clear English, surprising him. "My horse died. Walking, looking for water." "Where's your people?" Ethan asked, scanning the horizon again. It was unusual for an Apache woman to be traveling alone with an infant, especially this far from known tribal territories. The woman's face darkened with what might have been shame or fear. "Cannot go back," she said simply. "Banished." The single word carried a weight of tragedy that Ethan didn't fully understand, but he recognized desperation when he saw it. Whatever had led to her exile from her tribe, she was now completely alone in a hostile landscape with only a baby depending on her survival. As the sun continued its descent toward the western mountains, Ethan faced a decision that would test every principle he held dear. Taking this woman and her child into town would create an explosive situation. The residents of Cedar Ridge were already frightened and suspicious of any Apache presence. But leaving her here to die was unconscionable, regardless of the political complications. "Can you ride?" he asked finally. The woman nodded weakly, though Ethan doubted she had the strength to stay mounted for long. He helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed dangerously before steadying herself against the boulder. The baby in her arms was disturbingly quiet, a bad sign that spoke of severe dehydration and malnutrition. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said as he assisted her toward his horse. "I'm the sheriff of Cedar Ridge. I'm going to take you to my cabin where you can rest and get proper food and water." "Why?" the woman asked, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or hidden motives. Why help Apache woman? It was a fair question, one that Ethan wasn't entirely sure how to answer. In a land where racial hatred ran deep and trust between whites and Indians was virtually non-existent, his decision defied both logic and self-preservation. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, helping her mount behind him on his horse. Sometimes that's reason enough. As they rode toward his cabin in the gathering dusk, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this simple act of mercy was about to change everything in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Ethan's cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by juniper trees, a modest but well-built structure of pine logs and adobe mortar that he had constructed himself during his first year as sheriff. As he helped the Apache woman down from his horse, he could feel her trembling with exhaustion and the lingering effects of severe dehydration. "Easy now," he said gently, supporting her weight as she swayed on her feet. "Let's get you and the little one inside where it's safe." The interior of the cabin was spartanly furnished but clean and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a simple wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room. Ethan's bed sat in one corner, and shelves lined with books and supplies took up most of the remaining wall space. It was the home of a solitary man who valued order and simplicity. Ethan quickly stoked the fire and set a pot of water to boil, while the woman settled carefully onto his bed, still clutching her infant. In the lamplight, he could see just how dire their condition truly was. The baby's skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of severe malnutrition, and the mother's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. "What's your name?" Ethan asked as he prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, adding extra water to make it easier for them to digest. "Ayana," she replied softly, her voice still hoarse despite the water she had consumed. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "My son." She looked down at the baby with infinite tenderness. "His name is Koa. It means warrior." "That's a strong name," Ethan said, bringing her a bowl of the thin stew and a cup of cool water. "How old is he?" 6 months, Ayana said, accepting the food gratefully. "But he has been sick. The journey, it has been hard on both of us." As she ate slowly, Ethan could see color beginning to return to her face. The baby, Koa, seemed more alert as well, his dark eyes tracking the movement of the flames in the fireplace. It was a good sign. Children were remarkably resilient if they received proper care in time. "You said you were banished," Ethan said carefully, sitting across from her at the table. "If you don't mind me asking, what happened?" Ayana's expression grew guarded, and for a moment Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of deep pain and regret. "My husband was a war chief, very respected among our people, but he wanted peace with the white man, wanted to find a way for our children to live in both worlds." She paused, adjusting Koa in her arms. "Many warriors thought he was weak, that he betrayed our ways. When he was killed in a raid 3 months ago, they said it was punishment from the spirits." "And they blamed you?" Ethan asked. "They said I poisoned his mind with talk of peace, made him forget he was Apache." Ayana's voice grew bitter. The new war chief, Nailnish, he declared that Koa and I were no longer welcome. We had 3 days to leave or face death. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. He had heard of Nailnish, a fierce warrior leader who had been orchestrating the recent raids against white settlements. If Ayana was connected to him, her presence here put them both in grave danger. "Nailnish," Ethan repeated slowly. "He's your new chief." Ayana nodded grimly. "My brother-in-law. He always hated my husband's peace talks. Always believed the only solution was to drive all whites from Apache lands." She looked directly at Ethan. "He would kill you without hesitation if he knew you helped us." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the cabin walls, the distant whinny of horses moving through the night. Ethan immediately extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. In the moonlight, he could make out shadowy figures positioned among the trees surrounding his cabin. They found us, Ayanna whispered, fear evident in her voice as she held Koa closer. Ethan counted at least 6 warriors that he could see, painted for war and armed with rifles as well as traditional weapons. They had surrounded the cabin with the practiced efficiency of experienced fighters, cutting off all escape routes. The fact that they hadn't already attacked suggested they wanted something more than simple revenge. How many men does Nailnish command? Ethan asked quietly, checking his rifle and revolver. 30, maybe 40 warriors, Ayanna replied. But he would not bring them all for just me. This is about something more. A voice called out from the darkness, speaking in rapid Apache. Ayanna translated in a whisper. He says he knows his sister-in-law is inside. He wants to talk. Ethan felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He was outnumbered and surrounded, with a woman and infant depending on his protection. Every instinct told him to prepare for a fight, but Ayanna's next words gave him pause. He also says he comes under a flag of truce, she continued. In Apache law, that means no blood will be spilled tonight if you agree to meet with him. And if I refuse? Ayanna's dark eyes met his across the darkened cabin. Then we all die at dawn. Outside, the sound of horses moving closer signaled that their time for decision was running out. Ethan looked at the young mother and her child, then at his rifle, weighing his options. In his 6 years as sheriff, he had faced down bank robbers, cattle rustlers, and drunken miners, but he had never confronted a situation quite like this. Tell him I'll meet with him, Ethan said finally. But it happens here on my land, under my terms. As Ayanna called out his response in Apache, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would determine not just their survival, but the future of peace between two peoples balanced on the knife's edge of war. Dawn was still hours away when Ethan stepped onto his front porch, hands deliberately visible and empty except for a white cloth tied to a wooden stick. The desert air was crisp and filled with tension so thick it seemed to press against his chest like a physical weight. Around the clearing, he could now see more Apache warriors than he had initially counted, at least a dozen, possibly more hidden among the shadows and trees. From the darkness emerged a figure that commanded immediate respect and fear in equal measure. Nailnish was a man in his 30s, tall and powerfully built, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His face was painted with red and black war markings, and his eyes burned with an intensity that made Ethan's blood run cold. Unlike his warriors, who carried primarily rifles, Nailnish wore traditional weapons, a bone knife at his belt and a war club decorated with eagle feathers and bear claws. "You're the white man's law in this place," Nailnish said in heavily accented but clear English, stopping just outside the circle of light cast by Ethan's porch lantern. "I am Nailnish, war chief of the Chiricahua. We have business to discuss." "Sheriff Ethan Carter," Ethan replied, keeping his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I'm listening." "My brother's widow and his son are in your house," Nailnish continued, his hand resting casually on his knife handle. "She was banished from our people for bringing shame upon our tribe. Yet you give her shelter, food, protection. What?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Ethan could feel the eyes of every warrior focused on him, waiting for an answer that would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Behind him, through the cabin's open door, he could hear Ayanna softly singing a lullaby to little Koa in her native language. Because she was dying, Ethan said simply. She and her baby were dying of thirst on the road. I couldn't just ride past and let that happen. Nailnish circled slowly around the porch, his movements predatory and calculated. White men do not help Apache without reason. They take our land, kill our people, break every promise they make. What do you want from her? What do you plan to take? Nothing, Ethan replied, turning to keep the war chief in sight. I want nothing from her except to see her and the child survive. A harsh laugh escaped Nailnish's lips. You lie. All white men lie. You think to use her, maybe sell information about our camps, our movements. Or perhaps you think to make her your woman, to own an Apache like you own your cattle. The accusation hit Ethan like a physical blow, and he felt anger surge through him. But losing his temper now would mean death for all of them. Instead, he forced himself to remain calm, To think like the lawman he was rather than react like the man he was. If that were true, Ethan said carefully, why would I let you take her? If I wanted something from her, wouldn't I have refused your demands and fought to keep her? Nailnish paused in his circling, clearly not having expected that response. Before he could answer, the cabin door opened and Ayanna stepped onto the porch, still carrying Koa in her arms. Several warriors immediately raised their rifles, but Nailnish held up a hand to stop them. Brother of my husband, Ayanna said formally in English, then continued in rapid Apache. Ethan couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion in her voice, pain, defiance, and something that sounded like pleading. Nailnish responded sharply in Apache, his tone clearly dismissive. Ayanna's voice rose in reply, and Ethan caught the word peace spoken in English amid the stream of native words. The exchange continued for several minutes, growing more heated with each exchange. Finally, Ayanna turned to Ethan, tears glistening in her eyes. He says you have poisoned my mind, just as I poisoned my husband's. He says no white man can be trusted, that your kindness is a trap to make Apache weak and foolish. And what did you tell him? Ethan asked. I told him that my husband was right, that some white men can be honorable, that peace is possible if both sides choose to see the humanity in their enemies. She looked back at Nailnish. I told him that you risked your life to save strangers, expecting nothing in return, that this is the kind of man my husband hoped to build friendship with. Nailnish spat into the dust, his disgust evident. Your husband is dead because of such foolish thoughts. The white man's friendship is like the desert mirage. It appears real from far away but disappears when you try to touch it. Maybe, Ethan said, stepping forward despite the immediate tensing of the surrounding warriors. But what if it's not? What if some of us actually mean what we say? Prove it, Nailnish snarled, moving closer until they were face to face. If your heart is pure, if you truly want nothing from her, then let me take them now. Give up my brother's woman and son without fight, without payment, without condition. The challenge hung between them like a blade. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that his next words would either defuse this dangerous situation or trigger a bloodbath that would spread far beyond his small cabin. But as he looked at Ayanna holding her child, as he thought about the trust she had placed in him and the simple human decency that had started this entire confrontation, his choice became clear. You can take them, Ethan said quietly, but only if that's what she wants. Not because you command it, not because of tribal law or ancient customs, but because she chooses to go with you of her own free will. The silence that followed was so complete that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Nailnish's eyes widened slightly, clearly. He had not expected this response either. All eyes turned to Ayanna, who stood frozen between two worlds, holding the future of peace or war in her trembling hands. The silence stretched across the clearing like a taut bowstring, broken only by the gentle cooing of baby Koa and the whisper of wind through the juniper trees. Ayanna stood between the two men who represented the opposing forces that had torn her life apart, her brother-in-law who embodied the old ways of war and resistance, and the white sheriff who had shown her a glimpse of the peace her husband had died trying to achieve. You would let me choose? Ayanna asked Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. Even knowing what my choice might mean. Ethan nodded solemnly. It's your life, yours and Koa's. No man has the right to decide your fate for you, whether he's Apache or white. Nailnish's face darkened with anger. She is Apache. She belongs with her people, not with the enemy who steals our land and murders our children. My husband believed we could be Apache and still find ways to live in peace with the white world, Ayanna said, her voice growing stronger. He believed our children could learn from both peoples, could bridge the gap between our worlds. And your husband is dead because of those beliefs, Nailnish spat, killed by white soldiers who cared nothing for his peaceful words. He was killed by warriors from our own tribe who thought him weak, Ayanna replied sharply. Warriors who followed you into that doomed raid because you convinced them that war was the only answer. The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. For a moment, Nailnish's composed mask slipped, revealing the pain and guilt beneath his warrior's facade. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more uncertain. The raid was meant to be different. We were only going to take horses, supplies. When the shooting started, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. My husband died trying to stop the killing. Ayanna continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. He died trying to protect white women and children from warriors drunk on revenge. And for that, you called him traitor. Ethan watched the exchange in fascination, beginning to understand the complex web of grief, guilt, and misguided honor that had led to this moment. Nailnish wasn't simply a war chief bent on destruction. He was a man haunted by the consequences of his own choices, unable to admit that his pursuit of war had cost him his brother. I have made my choice, Ayanna said finally, looking directly at Nailnish. I will return with you to our people, but not as an exile. I return as the widow of a peace chief, carrying his vision for our children's future. Nailnish's eyes widened in surprise. You would come back? After being cast out, our people need to hear another voice besides yours, Ayanna replied firmly. They need to know that strength can come from wisdom as well as war, that surviving in this changing world might require adaptation, not just resistance. She turned to Ethan, her dark eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, respect born of shared principle. Sheriff Carter, you have shown me that my husband's dreams were not foolish. You have proven that some white men can see beyond the color of skin to the humanity beneath. And you've shown me that honor and courage aren't limited to any one people, Ethan replied. Your son will grow up knowing that his mother was the bravest person I've ever met. Ayanna carefully unwrapped a small beaded pouch from around her neck and pressed it into Ethan's hand. This belonged to my husband. It contains eagle down blessed by our medicine man for protection in battle. Not the battle of weapons, but the battle of hearts and minds. Nailnish watched this exchange with growing amazement. When Ayanna walked toward him, still carrying Koa, he made no move to claim them as possessions were claimed, but rather stepped back respectfully. If you return, he said slowly, things will not be easy. Many still believe you brought shame to our tribe. Then I will work to change their minds, Ayanna replied, just as you must work to change yours. The world is changing whether we wish it or not. We can change with it and survive, or cling to old ways and watch our children die for our stubbornness. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, the Apache warriors emerged from their hiding places, no longer moving with the stealth of raiders, but with the measured dignity of an honor guard. Nailnish helped Ayanna mount one of their horses, his movements gentle and respectful. Before they rode away, Nailnish approached Ethan one final time. You have given me much to think about, White Sheriff. Perhaps there are things my brother understood that I did not. Your brother was a wise man, Ethan replied. Maybe it's not too late to honor his wisdom along with his memory. As the Apache band disappeared into the growing light, Ethan stood alone on his porch, clutching the small beaded pouch Ayanna had given him. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the chimneys of Cedar Ridge as the town began to wake, unaware of how close they had come to war in the night. The road toward peace would be long and difficult, filled with setbacks and misunderstandings. But for the first time since he'd pinned on his sheriff's badge, Ethan believed it might actually be possible. One cup of water, one act of simple human decency, had planted a seed that might, just might, grow into something larger than the hatred and fear that had divided two peoples for so long. As he turned to go back inside his cabin, Ethan found himself smiling. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carried the greatest power to change the world.